All right, it's 8:30 and we can, I think we will start officially. First, let me welcome all the participants. Thank you for joining early morning at 8:30. But most of all, I need to thank very especially Professor Gary Barkhuizen for accepting this invitation to be here to be a part of the pre-conference events of Hours 23. So this event is jointly organized by the PGI and the Research Unit and Open University. And we're really excited, and I'm actually really so thrilled that Professor Barkhuizen accepted our invitation. And I should just give a very brief introduction, even though I'm sure it's not really needed. So Professor Barkhuizen is Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Free State, South Africa. His research focuses on language teacher education, teacher and learner identity, study abroad, and narrative inquiry. And today he will be talking about narrative inquiry. And before I hand it over to Professor Barkhuizen, I also would like to thank very specially Dr. Ketaki Nagahawatta for facilitating this great opportunity for all of us. Ketaki was so kind enough to speak to Professor Barkhuizen and make the initial contact. So I'd really like to thank Dr. Ketaki as well. So over to you, Professor Gary.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to your special occasion, these the pre-conference sessions. It's strange being back on an online Zoom meeting. I haven't done it for a while because we've been back face to face with recent conferences, but it's great to make connections, and I wish you well with the rest of today and also with the conference that's coming up. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about narrative inquiry, and I thought what I would do would just give a broad overview, and I haven't planned too much because I thought maybe we could spend a little bit of time, answering some questions or having some discussion. Well, actually, I have prepared quite a bit, but I'll see how the time goes, and I can cut out and add, depending on how things go. So one of the challenges for me always is to see if I can share my screen successfully. So I'm going to give it a try and see how that goes. So I think you can see that, right? Is that all right? Can you see the screen? Cool.
Yes, we can.
What I plan to cover then is to look at the question, what is narrative inquiry and what is story? Because story, of course, is central to narrative inquiry. And then I wrote a handbook chapter a couple of years ago on narrative inquiry, and I structured the chapter by talking about 5 core dimensions of narrative inquiry. And these core dimensions help me make sense of the broad field of narrative inquiry. And the dimensions are, well, I'll explain when I get to them, but they sort of break down narrative inquiry for me. And I've presented on this a number of times, and the feedback I've got is that the participants feel that it helps them get an overview of the broad field of narrative inquiry, particularly in my field, which is in language teaching and language learning, so in the applied linguistics field. So I'll talk about that, and then very briefly I'll end with some new developments in narrative inquiry, which were recently published in a special issue of the journal System. So I'll just point those out to you because they do summarize to a certain extent of some quite innovative, recent, pushing the edge developments in narrative inquiry. So that's what I've got planned, and we'll just see how that goes. Let me just keep an eye on the time here. So we've got about 1 hour altogether. Right. So when we talk about narrative inquiry, of course, we're always talking about stories. Narrative inquiry has as its central concern the stories that narrators tell about their life experiences. So we've got 2 important concepts here with just that one sentence that you could see. One of them is stories, and the other is life experiences. So the stories are about the life experiences of the narrators, which are typically the life experiences of our research participants. But of course, if it was just that, then narrative inquiry would be simple. It would be easy. It would be, just telling stories. But narrative inquiry is much more than the telling of stories. So what else is it? Well, it's also about making meaning of those life experiences in the process of telling stories. So what we have is three important components here of narrative inquiry. And I always like to remember these when I'm thinking basically about what is this that I'm doing when I'm doing narrative inquiry. We've got stories about the narrator's life experiences, but most important is that it's making meaning of those life experiences. It's the narrators making meaning when they tell their stories, and it's researchers making meaning when they co-construct or listen or read the stories of the narrators. All right, so it's the stories, it's the life experiences, and it's the making meaning of those life experiences through the process of storytelling. Another important point, I'm just giving you a couple of big overview points here. Another important one is in the process of this exploring life experiences, how central is story? Now, for me, I believe that story is really important because often I've got this continuum here of more or less continuum that I mentioned, where we've got story as being less evident in the research that we read. Sometimes we get research that claims to be narrative inquiry, but it just seems like regular qualitative research. There's no story there. It's not particularly evident that there are stories either in the data or stories that are written by the researcher. So on the left side of this continuum, it just seems like regular qualitative research. The research may be about the experiences of the narrators, of the research participants. Well, that's right, because that's what qualitative research does. It explores the experiences of participants. But for me, there needs to be more story involved in the research for it to be narrative inquiry. So this is just another broad overview point I want to make about narrative inquiry. And we can come back to that. In fact, I will come back to that a little bit later. And then the third overview point I want to make right at the beginning is that what do we do with stories in the process of narrative inquiry? Well, researchers can collect stories from their participants. So the stories are in the data. So for example, you may be doing interviews with some teachers or interviews with some administrators or language learners. And in the process of the interviewing, they tell you stories. There are actual stories there. So the stories are in the data that you are collecting. The other thing that narrative inquirers do is that they configure stories from the data. All right. So you may have a series of interviews with the participant. Then what you do is from those interviews, you then write a story of the participant's experience, which could be about their identity, their professional development over time. It may be their story about implementing a policy. It may be their story about learning to do research. Whatever the case is, or whatever the data is, the second practice, I guess, or process of narrative inquiry is that researchers configure stories. So what we have is that there are stories in the data, you collect stories, or there are stories from the data. So you construct stories from the data, or you can do both. Of course, you can do both as well. So that's my third big point that I wanted to make. from an analytical perspective, what is the focus of our analysis in narrative inquiry? And here, there's often a distinction made between some narrative inquirers focusing on what the stories are about. In other words, their content. So what this simply means is, if someone says, "Oh, I must tell you what happened yesterday," you said, "Oh, what happened? What happened?" You want to know the content of the story, what they are about. So some narrative inquirers focus more on that content, what the stories are about. Others focus more on what the narratives or what the stories look like, how they've been organized, how they've been structured. So linguists would be quite interested in the form or the structure of the stories. So would sociolinguists, for example, discourse analysts, conversation analysts, would be interested in how stories are constructed, right? So I'll come back to this a little bit later as well. The other third focus, and this is always the focus, no matter whether you focus on context on content or on form, you need to also to focus on the context of the narrative. And context can have two different meanings, or many meanings, but two main meanings. One of them is looking at the story world. So this is the events that were experienced in the story. So who the characters are, what they did, what the action is, and so on. It's looking at what happened in the story world that is told. The other is the context of the storytelling. So this is looking at the language used, the discourse used, the environment in which the stories were told, what storytelling practices were used, the cultural practices, and so on. So the storytelling process, as opposed to the story world, which is what happened in the story, the actual story that was lived and experienced, okay? Or any combination of these, content, form. There's always going to be, even if you focus on content, there will be some focus on form, and the other way around too. If you're focusing on the linguistic structure of a story, you've got to also look at what it was about, all right? So there's some focus on the context as well, the content as well. Okay, so I would like just to very quickly give a little overview of some key works in applied linguistics and language teaching. This one goes back all the way to 2002. So these are some key works, but they also give important messages about narrative inquiry. So this is by Johnson and Golombek, and they edited this book of Teachers' Narrative Inquiry. If you have a look at the title, you can see it's Teachers' Narrative Inquiry. This is teachers doing narrative inquiry of their own practices. So here you've got inquiry into experiences enable teachers to act with foresight. It gives them increasing control over their thoughts and actions, grants their experiences enriched, deepened meaning, and enables them to be more thoughtful about their work. So here we've got narrative inquiry that is done by teachers, for their own learning and professional development to enable them to be better practitioners, okay? Here we've got, this was a special issue some time ago, 1997, in the journal Teaching and Teacher Education, all on narrative inquiry. And here we've got Fenstermacher, who's saying that one of the truly valuable contributions of narrative inquiry in education is the revelation of the intentions and beliefs of teachers. Through narrative inquiry, we begin to understand the actor's reasons. And by we, he means researchers. So here, this is researchers doing research on teachers and learners and so on. So the first book by Johnson and Golombek was teachers doing narrative inquiry on themselves. And then here we've got narrative inquirers as researchers doing research on teachers. This is what I do, for example, where I focus my research lens on teachers and other practitioners and so on. I introduced this term some time ago called narrative knowledging. This is the process of meaning making during all activities in narrative inquiry. And by narrative knowledging, I mean it's the understanding, the knowledge construction that takes place during all the activities of narrative inquiry. The data collection, it's like interviewing, for example, narrative, the analyzing of data, even the reporting of the findings, you know, writing an article, writing a dissertation, and so on. Narrative knowledging, understanding the life experiences of the narrator is taking place. There's even narrative knowledging of the audience or the readers of an article or a dissertation, because then they are understanding the experiences of the research participants, the narrators. So this narrative knowledging is very much a cognitive activity. It's understanding, it's meaning making, but it's also social, because storytelling is a social activity, right? So it's an interesting concept that I created for the special issue of TESOL Quarterly in 2011. And it's something that's been taken up by a few people. And I've thought about it over and over again. And I think I still quite like the term, even though it's you know, now 12 years old. I like it because it's a verb, because it's something that we do when we're doing storytelling, when we're doing narrative inquiry. It's something that is moving, it's action. And so it's a social action, it's a cognitive action, it's a meaning-making action. So I still quite like it. And diagrammatically, you could look at it this way. If you think in this first block over here, this is the generation or the construction of the data. So for example, let's say the narrator is a teacher and the audience would be a researcher who is interested in this teacher's developing identity as a teacher. So they set up a series of interviews. So here during the interview process, there's some co-construction of data, because they'll, you know, interviews are always co-constructed. So while this is happening, you've got the narrator, the teacher, is making meaning of the stories that they are telling about their teaching. And the audience, this is the researcher, is also making meaning by co-constructing, by listening to, by taking part in the generation of this data. So this narrative knowledging takes place here while the data is being generated. So you get the data here, and you can do things with the data in terms of transcribing the interview, and you know how difficult that is. And listening carefully, making meaning takes place there. Narrative knowledging takes place here in the middle. And then when the researcher analyzes the data, again, very important, meaning making takes place. Although it's a stage removed, meaning making takes place here during the process of analysis. And you notice that the arrows are double-headed arrows, because it goes back and forth. Even when you're analyzing the data, you go back, obviously, to the data, but you may even go back to the recording, and maybe even go back to the participant to ask for further information about what you're analyzing. So this back and forth, it's not just a linear sequence, but back and forth movement during the narrative knowledging process, right? As the stories are told, retold, analyzed, and restoried by the narrative inquirer. And then when you're writing your report or presenting and preparing for a conference, or you are putting multimodal media together for a web page or Facebook group or whatever the case is, there's narrative knowledging, which is then read or listened to or watched by an audience, who then also further do this narrative knowledging as they try to understand and make meaning of the narrator's lived experience going all the way back there. So it's quite a responsibility you have as a narrative inquirer to try and represent this lived experience of the narrator that goes back through these multiple stages. This is a book I edited in 2013 that was had a number of chapters that I edited, brilliant chapters. I think there were 12 or 13 chapters by some narrative inquirers at the time. And what I did when I came to write the introductory chapter was to try and make sense of their approach to analysis, the varying approaches to analysis in the book. And so what I did, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what I did was I put together this analytical framework, narrative analysis framework that consisted of these 8 more or less dimensions. So the purpose of this was to say, okay, I'm doing a narrative inquiry project. Where does my project and the work I do, the narrative work I do, fit on this framework? So the first one is epistemology. Do I ascribe to a narrative epistemology? In other words, do I think that we make sense of the world narratively through story? Is that how we understand the world? And if so, would I then do narrative type research? And then dimension number 2, my methods would reflect or mirror narrative epistemology, and the methods would therefore be typical of narrative inquiry. So, you plot it along, be more or less focusing on content, focusing on form, looking at social practice, using stories to accomplish social practice. And then the co-construction of data. How involved in the co-construction of data was the researcher? And then the categorization of data. Was the data like a thematic analysis done, or was it storied in some way? So was it configured into a story, or was it ripped apart into themes and categories? So, the interesting dimensions and useful dimensions which I put together to try and capture the different analytical approaches that are done in narrative inquiry. And I had these circles to do with the different contexts in which these dimensions unfold in the process of narrative inquiry, the talk, the telling, and the macro context. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but just to show that I think one of the points I'm making here is that narrative inquiry, there's no one way of doing it, right? There's no formula for doing narrative inquiry. I mean, if there was, we'd all be right in the middle, or there wouldn't even be dimensions. But the point I'm making is that there are these dimensions here, and different narrative inquiries move along or would see themselves as being at certain places along these dimensions, or maybe see themselves moving along different points of the dimensions as they get involved in different projects. For those very interested in narrative, there's this in the Handbook of Narrative Analysis, in not only applied linguistics, but more broadly as well. Very comprehensive book, very authoritative. And if you're really interested, there's some fantastic chapters in that book. I don't want to talk too much about it. On the other extreme, there's this foundation book on narrative that I put together with Phil Benson and Alice Chick in 2014, where we wrote this book on a sort of how to do narrative inquiry in language teaching and learning research. And we drew on many studies. And basically what we do is use these studies to show what is done in the field. And we're just finishing off a second edition, which will be out next year in 2024, where we've updated the studies that we've used to show the developments in narrative inquiry in language teaching and learning. And there's so much more being done in the past 10 years, including work in digital narrative inquiry, and also in doctoral theses. So very innovative work done in PhD work. So we've got a chapter, or not a chapter, we've got a section in organizing a PhD, for example. But there's the most exciting, I think, in the new edition is the work on multimodal and digital narrative inquiry research. I just want to talk very quickly about the word story, which is what I've been, saying is central to narrative inquiry. So just very quickly make a point about what is story. And I want to say that, you know, story means different things to different people, of course. There's no one definition of what story is. So different cultures have different ideas about what story is, different socioeconomic groups. I mean, the work that William Labov did a long time ago in New York City showed this very clearly. Even different ages, if you think of the way stories are told by teenagers and young kids as opposed to much older people. Perhaps different genders have different ways of telling stories, and even individual people at different times, not only across their lifespan, but even within a day, for example. So stories mean different things to different people, and they're told in different ways by these different groups and individuals even. And they differ in terms of the content or what they are about. They also differ in their organization and their sequencing of that content. So how they are told, and Labov's work again showed that. They differ in what's in and what's left out, what can and can't be told. There are certain constraints, maybe cultural, sociocultural constraints or religious constraints about what can and can't be in stories, for example. And then, of course, the choice of semiotic resources that we have available to us to tell stories, not only language, of course, language is important, but now, you know, paralinguistic features, facial expression, gestures. But if you look at now on social media and other digital media where we can use colors and pictures and sound and music and, you know, emojis and so on, in many different ways, including, you know, material objects, the stories we tell with material objects in use of space. You know, particularly in classrooms, how the use of space, social space as well as physical space, and other material objects. The work by Suresh Kanagaraja, for example, and I'll show you an example later on of some recent work he's done on materiality, using material objects, incorporating material in the telling of stories. So it's much more than just you know, using language. But when I think of story, I have a number of features that I always go back to just so that I can try and, you know, center myself. And I just, on a sort of personal note, as I said earlier, I've become a little more inflexible, perhaps as I've got older, that when I'm talking about narrative inquiry, I really do want to see some story there. I've come across a number of articles where, you know, the title, a narrative inquiry of something, 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 and then I read the article and I say, where's the story? You know, it looks like a qualitative article or an exploratory practice article or something, and I don't see the story. So I've been a little more sort of determined to look for stories when I'm doing narrative inquiry. I want my own stories there, but when I'm reading others, I want to find the story. So what do I look for when I want to find a story? Well, firstly, they should narrate the experiences of the participants from past or an imagined future. So they tell about something that happened or will happen in the life of the person. So that's what I said in the very first slide. It's about the life experiences of the participants. They include reflective or evaluative commentary on those experiences. So they comment about beliefs or emotions relating to the experiences, right? So it's not just this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened, but rather you say something about them. Like, you know, I woke up this morning and I was feeling terrible and I wasn't looking forward to the day ahead. But then I got to work and suddenly everything brightened up. It was great. I met wonderful people. I was in a good mood and I started to accomplish things, you know, and I felt great. So you add these emotions and you add these evaluations of what happened. That's what makes a story as well. Typically, stories have a temporal or a time dimension, all right? So there's, you know, in literature, we talk about the plot. Something happens over a period of time. Stories embody action. Something happens in the story, in some spatio-temporal, some space and time context, right? So there's things happen in the story. This is something I like to see. Stories have, just like in literature, they have, there's a who involved. There are characters. Who is in the story? When the action took place. That's that time dimension again. And I like to ask a where question. Where does the action take place? Social space as well as physical place, right? So who, where, and when. I like to look where the characters, what is happening over time, right? And where does it unfold? What social space? What physical place? Right. So that and then the final one is by this, the brilliant work of Ox and Capps, and they talk about tellability. So stories, you can usually measure their tellability. It refers to the extent to which the account conveys reportable events that make a rhetorical, a point. Are they sort of, are they effective or unique in some way, the story? So are they interesting? Are they exciting? Or, like a shopping list, not very exciting, right? So are they tellable? Is there a high level of tellability? Interesting. Oh, I've got something to tell you. What happened? What happened? Oh, that's exciting, right? So the high level of tellability. You get that with stories, right? You don't get that with shopping lists, for example. All right, so that's a sort of big overview, and the rest of the time I'll work on these core dimensions. We're zipping along quite nicely here. If you have any questions, perhaps put up your hand or something. But I will try and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So this is a reference to that handbook chapter I mentioned, the 5 core dimensions, which for me, these dimensions, as I said, when I wrote this, was one way of just trying to think about how do I break all this down. There's so much out there, from narrative inquiry in so many fields. Yes, in applied linguistics and language teaching and learning, but in psychotherapy, in nursing, in social work, in general education, in so many fields. But how do I break it down for me in my work, particularly in applied linguistics? So the first dimension, I'll spend time on only 3 of them, not all of them. But this first one, just very quickly, I like to make this distinct. Well, it's not a distinction, it's a continuum. So it's, you more towards this end in terms of your work, maybe, or more towards this end. It's not here or there. It's somewhere along this dimension. So on this end over here, is what I call narrative study. This is the study of narrative. It's linguistic and organizational structure of narrative. So the focus is on narrative as text. The object of the study is narrative. So, if you were in literature, you'd be studying narrative as text. Narratology would be called, I believe. So here you're looking at what is narrative. That's your whole focus, study of narrative. But towards this end, this is narrative inquiry, using narrative as a method, narrative as methodology, right? Here, the focus is on the content of narratives, for example, what they are about. So using narrative in order to find out what the stories are about. Or as Anna Defina says, using stories and storytelling as a methodological tool to investigate individual or group experiences and identities, for example. Okay, so this is an interesting, useful distinction, where our focus today, and my focus, is on narrative inquiry. So this is where I'm going to focus for the rest of today, on the method or methodology of narrative inquiry. The second dimension, this is one I chose to talk about because much of narrative inquiry takes place as interviews or conversation, looking at conversation. Yes, we have written narratives. Of course, we do in narrative inquiry, but a lot of it has to do with some form of interaction, even written interaction for that matter. But here the focus is more on spoken interaction. So on the left-hand side here, we've got stories as interaction. So this is how the stories take shape interactionally. So we want to see how the stories play out through interaction. So you may be guessing already that researchers here would be interested in the storytelling as doing social actions, such as constructing identities, all right? And the the researchers interested in this would be discourse analysts or conversation analysts. So what they do is they analyze the discourse to see what the stories are doing in terms of displaying and constructing the identities of the participants engaging in that interaction. Okay, so that is stories as interaction. That's the focus. And then as we move towards the other side of that dimension, we get stories from interaction. And what I mean here is that in the interaction, which could be interviews or conversation, you take out an excerpt of that interaction. So the story is from the interaction, and then you analyze it, which could be a whole interview for that matter, but you analyze it for what they are about, for their content. So the stories are extracted from the interactional data rather than analyzed as interaction. Okay, and of course, there's a little bit of both. So you can be stuck in the middle, not stuck, but you can be participating. You can be practicing in the middle here somewhere. But the work I do tends to be more on the right-hand side here. But of course, you also have to look at the interaction, even if you are on the right-hand side. So as an example, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but if you have a look at this interaction here, which comes from Matthew Pryor and Steve Talmy, you can see two pre-service teachers are discussing the competitive job market. And in this interaction, they are displaying their concerns and emotions about their role as about their position, their identities as pre-service teachers in the competitive job market situation. And if you look at the transcript, you can see there's a very detailed transcript here where there are pauses, there are overlaps. It shows very clearly how the turn taking takes place, where there's emphasis with underlining and capital letters. Even, the pauses are counted in line 24, 1 second, half a second, where there's ellipsis and so on. So very detailed, because here they would be looking at the conversation analysis outcome of how the participants' identities as pre-service teachers with their emotions are, how they unfold in the course of this interaction. So that would be stories as interaction, the unfolding of the story in interaction. Whereas here, we've got an extract of an interview with a teacher educator talking about his identity. So here's this, you can see that the transcript is very broad. I am a person who is interested in the students. I want them to learn what is the implication of being a teacher. No pauses marked, no overlaps marked, and so on. So quite a broad transcription. And what I do often with the type of analysis is called a short story analysis, which I'm not going to talk about much more today, except with a short story analysis, I start my content analysis by asking who is in the story, and you can see they're marked in red. I ask when did the story take place, so I look for indications of time in the story, often through tense markers, but other explicit markers like yesterday, today, in the past, and so on, and where markers, which could be physical places or social spaces as well. And then I ask those questions and I go through a detailed line-by-line analysis, and then I look at the context of the story by looking at the micro scales of context, and then I move out to the institutional community scale, and then to the macro, the sort of ideological scale of context, that take place in the bigger discussions, the bigger discourses we had about teacher education, about global movements, maybe to do with immigration, what happens with governments and ministries of education, and so on. All of which impact what happens inside the classroom. All right, so they're all interrelated, those varying scales of context. But my focus in doing that story from interaction, short story analysis, is on the content of what is going on in the story. Okay, so if I just want to go back, so we've got stories as interaction, stories from interaction, and I've given you those two examples. Just very quickly, at dimension 3, a question I often get is, how involved in the narrative inquiry should the researcher be? Because often students starting out in research get very concerned about things like objectivity and subjectivity, and how will I influence the data that's being generated, and so on. Well, I mean, that will happen with narrative inquiry. You will definitely be there co-constructing the data with your participants. So there may be some cases where there's less engagement, such as the text analysis, where there may even be no contact with the narrator. You may be cases where you have a one-off interview and then do a discourse analysis of that interview text. So very limited engagement with a narrator, minimal relationship between the researcher and the participant on this side of the dimension, less engagement. But on the other side, there's frequently in narrative inquiry much more engagement. As Josselson says, narrative inquiry is inherently a relational endeavor, often through multiple interviews, classroom observation, informal conversations, and so on. It's a relationship that is the essence of engagement in narrative inquiry. Again, that's also from Josselson. And Clarendon and Connery refer to being in the midst. So it's being in the midst, being in the life of your narrative participants. Now, I think that in many cases is very difficult to achieve, unless perhaps you're doing a long-term project and with lots of time, where you can spend in schools and classrooms with your participants and so on. But generally, we don't have that luxury, and we will sort of be somewhere in the middle here with most realistic research projects that we have. Dimension 4 is another question that comes up quite a bit, and I raised it earlier on, is that, sometimes we do an interview. I'm going to do a narrative inquiry, and I'm going to do an interview, and I'm going to get stories from our participants. And you do your interview, and they didn't tell me any stories, right? So you end up with some sort of non-story data. You get a question, answer, with not a story in sight, all right? So this non-story data. Some multimodal digital stories may seem unconventional as stories. Maybe we're not used to them traditionally as stories, and so on. Whereas data in story form, some obvious examples are language learning histories, where learners write a history of their language learning experiences, and then it's a story of their history. Or teacher journals often are filled with stories. Not always, it may just be pure reflection where there's no story involved, but often you'll find interesting stories in teacher journals. And the short story I was telling you about, I showed you that example of the teacher educator, a nice little short story, which are often included in interview processes. And sometimes we get memoirs that are written. So just for example, here's some non-story data over here. This was from an interview I did with a study abroad student, where I asked the question, that was the main message that you came up with, just to be more fluent and perhaps a little more. So how did that turn out? Well, in terms of confidence, I really gained a lot of confidence. I feel more comfortable. I feel I need to prepare. So it just answers the question, right? No story there. Yeah, because I remember last time you said you try to work out in your head. I'm trying to get him to say something story. You just said, yeah. And now you think just it's become easier. Yeah, I guess I care less about it. So he just answers the question. No story, even though I was hoping he would tell stories. Now, this picture from that book I mentioned earlier, this is a drawing of a student as an English learner. So is this a story, I wonder? I mean, I guess you could call it a visual story. There may be some questions about if it's a story or not. But I think more and more we are accepting visual data as narrative data. So I guess I'm moving more towards saying that this drawing of the student is a story, particularly if they do talk about it then or write about it, then they can, they could tell a story about that one. This is very much a story. So here we have on the right side of the continuum data in story form. Here we have an example of an immigrant from South Africa now living in New Zealand who tells a story about how she now feels accepted, that how she accepts that people in New Zealand see her as an immigrant. And she's quite happy with that. I won't read the story, but she says, I now accept that people know I'm a South African, or that at least I'm not from here, or whatever that means. It's not a big deal. And she goes on to say that, she actually tells a story about, going to, actually today, she said in line 15, I was at an appointment this morning. And sometimes I find that, oh gosh, so she tells a story within a story about how she feels being a South African immigrant, speaking a different accented English, living in New Zealand. So a nice little story. She ends it by saying, I'm good, mostly I'm fine. So nice coda finishing off the story. So definitely a story, a data in story form. And then finally, the fifth dimension here, which I referred to right at the beginning, is analysis of narrative. These are Donald Polkinghorne's terms, analysis of narrative or narrative analysis. So on this end here, we get some data, and then we do a conventional thematic or a content analysis of that data. This is like coding for themes, categorizing the themes and looking at how those themes associated, how they relate to each other, how they pattern together, right? So this is the analysis of the narrative data that we have collected, okay? On the other side, we get narrative analysis, and this is the configuring of the data content into a coherent storied whole. So the outcome of the analysis here is a story. It's putting the data together into a story. And of course, you can do both. So you need to do some sort of thematic analysis, I guess, in order to configure that story. And if you have multiple participants and you've got multiple stories, then you can do a thematic analysis of those multiple stories that you have configured as well. Okay, so this is an interesting distinction where we've got analysis of narrative and then the narrative analysis. So just briefly, this is an interesting illustration of analysis of narratives. I'll just put all these three up together. If we start at the bottom of the screen, the bottom left of the screen, you can see here I've got an excerpt of data. When I got a part-time job as a lecturer, this was from a written narrative in a postgraduate course I taught some time ago, where the teacher was telling a story about the practices in a new job that she taught. So here she's telling the story about the school practices in which there was a tension between her as a teacher and the school. So this arrow represents a tension. Now, this is one theme, one tension theme that relates to this category of teacher and school. The teacher and school is a tension that we discovered in the narratives we wrote and discussed in this postgraduate course. It was sort of like an exploratory action research project we did as a class, right? So these were the other themes: mission, values, and goals, the other teachers. There were tensions between the teacher and these other themes over here. On the top left, you can see how I represented this diagrammatically, where we've got teacher in the middle and the tension with learners, tension with the school, tension with the curriculum, tension with the community. So each of these represents a theme, a thematic analysis. From the thematic analysis, here are the different themes, top right, that form this category of teacher and school. And here is the actual data from the narrative where we found the theme of practices. Okay, so that's the analysis of the narratives. And here is an example. This is with one of my PhD students, where we wrote a story based on the narrative, based on the data, some interview data. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see it starts off. So this is putting the data into story form as our findings, right? So this is Yuichi's story. This is immigrants from Japan who came to New Zealand to escape the nuclear disaster from 2011. Having got to New Zealand, they then had to go about learning English because this particular participant's English was not very good. So after resigning his job and moving to be with his wife and child away from where the Fukushima disaster occurred, there you see we're telling a good narrative here. But it's not just any story. This is a research story. So it's got to include not only the experiences of the participant, it's also got to include the topic of the research, and it's also got to be theoretically informed. So you can see later on in the middle, first he attended an English school for 6 months and fulfilled the English language requirement for admission. So he's now investing in English learning. And we use Bonnie Norton's theory of investment and identity. So the theory needs to be incorporated into the story you write. You're not just simply writing a story, all right? The theory needs to be there. And also, of course, it's about English learning, in second language acquisition. So it's about English learning, it's about immigration, and it's about the life experiences. So all of those three aspects are there in the story. It's a very difficult job to do as part of narrative inquiry. It's not simply telling stories. What I said right at the beginning, narrative inquiry is not simply just telling stories. And just to end for the last 2 minutes, I want to just talk about some new developments in narrative inquiry. This is a special topic issue of system that I co-edited with Sal Consoli in 2021, and we called it Pushing the Edge in Narrative Inquiry. And all the articles in the special issue are advancements in narrative inquiry. It's not just summarizing what's happened before. It's all something new that has developed. So this was the editorial, which was actually almost about a 10,000 word article that we used those 5 core dimensions actually in order to structure the article and introduce the, to structure our article and introduce the special issue. Here there's an article by Peter DaCosta and colleagues on ethical challenges in narrative inquiry. This is Suresh Kanagarajas on materializing narratives. And here he talks about the material resources which are traditionally relegated to context. And he says they should not be divorced from the actions and experiences that are very much part of the narratives that we look at in narrative inquiry. So that's the one I mentioned earlier. Phil Benson also talks about a different conceptualization of context, and he talks about space, and he defines space. A very interesting look at space in his article. Golombek and Johnson in Language Teacher Education look at, again, teachers' narrative inquiry in their teacher education program, and how teacher educators mediate the process of narrative knowledging through the work that they do in a teacher education program. Excellent, excellent article. Vincent Grenier and Ian Moody look at narrative frames, which is something I created in 2008 and has developed enormously since. And they look at photo narrative frames. I'll just very quickly show you. This was the traditional narrative frame that I used, where basically you have a series of sentence starters, and then you complete the sentence starters to write a story. So there you can see where you have a sentence starter, and then you fill in the space, and what you end up with is a story. And then what they did in this article was they had the same thing, a narrative frame, but they invited the participant to choose a photo and put the photo into that blank space and then write this framed story based on that photo. Excellent idea, really nice idea. This study was about an expat teacher, I think in Korea. And more recently, I just examined a PhD thesis where the student used narrative frames on Qualtrics, where the frame became very dynamic, and she gave clues and suggestions and examples. So it was this dynamic frame that could be expanded and so on. I mean, way beyond my technical ability, but very exciting. This was an article in that special issue with visual data and multimodal data. This is Sal Consolis, where he used analytical software to construct stories. So using software to do the narrative analysis to construct stories. Matthew Pryor and Talmi, I showed you an extract earlier where they do very detailed conversation analysis. Georga Kopulu looks at small stories in social media. And then finally, Kaya Arda looks at positioning analysis in narrative inquiry. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I think we've got a couple of minutes. I'm happy to
Yes,
answer.
I think we should open the floor for questions. Anybody who would like to ask anything, please feel free to put your mic on, or you can put it in the chat. But please put it for everyone to see, so that.
If there are no questions, that's fine too.
Well, if I do have a question, if no, so Nadira has a question. So I'll yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this amazing talk, and I really learned a lot today. But this might be a stupid question, but I just was very interested when you spoke about what do you find are the most common ethical issues when it comes to narrative inquiries, and maybe students that you have supervised, like what seems to be a common thread? Maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. One of the interesting things with all research, but particularly narrative inquiry, is that it involves stories, right? And with stories, when we tell and share stories, often in interviews, the participants get so wrapped up in their interviews that they share much more than they would normally do in a regular interview. Because in stories, you get involved in the story, particularly if you have built up a relationship, with the researcher over time. So you say much more. So I think there is a danger that coming up in the data will be information that perhaps in the cold light of day, the participant would have preferred not to have shared that information. And so that is a risk with narrative. And that article by Peter DaCosta and others mentioned that particularly. So one of the things to do that I prefer to do, if possible, is in the writing up of any article or dissertation or sections of writing, is to share your interpretation and the data that you include with your participants, if it's feasible, and let them see what you have what you have included and what you've said about it. And if they are happy for it to go in, then fine. But they may feel that they want to withdraw something, and ethically, then you would need to withdraw it. So that's one thing. I mean, at the stage before that, you could also share the interview transcript with them. I mean, that we include as an option in our ethics approval processes here at the university. That's an option, it's not required. It is an option. It's something I advise students to think about carefully, because sometimes you don't use that data. You don't use all the data, and so it may not make it to the final, what you publish or put in a dissertation. And so there's a risk that the participant may want to take out too much. But again, it's perhaps you'll see it as more ethical that they do in fact see the transcript. I like them to see what I'm writing, and in fact I wrote an article that was published in TESOL Quarterly where I wrote up my interpretation, sent it to the participant, and then they wrote a response, which I then included in the article, in fact. So the publication had the response to my interpretation.
I think we have a number of questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Maybe you
Okay,
can...
so there's a question about the difference between narrative inquiry and discourse analysis. Well, one of the dimensions that I mentioned had discourse analysis on one side of the dimension. That was the stories as interaction would be more like discourse analysis. But on the other, stories from interaction would be much more the sort of content analysis, where there may be some looking at discourse, but not too much looking at discourse, typically. Okay. So to minimize researcher bias, well, I mean, with narrative inquiry, one doesn't really aim to minimize researcher bias, because as a narrative inquirer, you are co-constructing that data right from the beginning if you're doing interviews, for example. So, I mean, bias can mean different things to different people, right? You don't want to bias. What you're doing is you are working with participants, and you are representing and presenting their life experiences, which you need to respect. These are their stories, right? So you don't want to bias that in terms of any, say, moral stance or political stance, for example, to the point where their stories become disrespected or invisible. So that's the point. That's one meaning of bias. Another meaning of bias is like subjectivity, for example. Researcher subjectivity is going to be evident in narrative inquiry. And one of the ways of dealing with it is to say in any report how you have dealt with your position as a researcher. Positionality or reflexivity is another word that has become very popular. I've just submitted an article recently to a journal, and both reviewers in their reviews wanted to know more about what I did as a researcher. Even though I had my methodology and said where I'm from and so on, they wanted more on reflexivity. It's becoming very important now, and through the process of reporting on your reflexivity, your biases and subjectivity will be reported on. There's a question here about story world and storytelling. So the story world is the characters in the story. It's what you are telling about. And the storytelling context is how you are telling. And, so if I'm in an interview, who is in the interview? Where are we doing the interview? This is the storytelling context. What language are we using? What is the time we've got available? This is the process of storytelling. The story world are the characters in the story. What was told? What actually happened in the story? That's the story world. The characters, the people, what you told about, the emotions that were expressed in the story. The storytelling is the actual physical context of storytelling, which again, discourse analysts would be particularly interested in. Someone who does a content analysis would be more interested in the story world.
If you have time, I'd like to ask a question as well. Again, it may not be the smartest. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you see narrative epistemology? You mentioned it in your talk, and I'd like to hear more about it, like how you see it.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably goes back to the work that Jerome Bruner did in psychology, where he talks about two modes of knowing or two ways of knowing about the world, right? Well, epistemology is about knowing the world and knowing about things, okay? How we make meaning of the world. And Jerome Bruno spoke about two different ways. One was a paradigmatic way or paradigmatic way. And that is how we categorize the world, right? So we break it down into categories of things. So, you know, we know that furniture, that's one big category. So we know the world by saying there's this thing called furniture, and it's got tables and it's got chairs. And chairs has different categories as well. It's got a sofa or now a seat, or it's got a stool. And so we break things down, we categorize. Another way of knowing, Bruner talks about, is a narrative way of knowing. That's a putting together way of knowing and looking for the particulars, the context in which, you know, a storied way of knowing, putting together, looking at the particulars of things. And so he argues that you can know the world through narrative, through story, by putting things together, by making things coherent through stories, and so on. So if you believe that, or you believe strongly that we do that, then your epistemology about your way of knowing, if you supported that, that would be a narrative epistemology. So I certainly follow a narrative epistemology in the way I see people making sense of the world. I know people who just talk stories all the time, who make sense of their life through stories, right? And because I have that belief, that epistemological belief about knowing the world, the type of research I do will obviously reflect that. And if the type of research I do, the methodology I choose would reflect that epistemology, right? And so I would use methods that invite people to tell stories, to put things together, to, you know, in stories, that's what we do. We bring things together rather than break things down according to the paradigmatic way of knowing. Now, I'm not saying that research is meaningless. It's very important. Otherwise, we wouldn't have science, right? And, you know, we wouldn't have chemistry, and we need all of that. Even in the social sciences and humanities, we need different. I'm a relativist. We need these different ways of knowing the world. But my own particular way of knowing the world is through story. It's a narrative epistemology.
Thank you so much. That was so comprehensive.
Okay.
I think I should really just thank you so much for all the time that you've spent with us, especially considering you're just back from China and that you're still on leave. You agreed to do.
You're
And
welcome. I
so
thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'm so glad, and actually it's really an honor and a privilege to have had you. And this recording is probably going to be like gold at this point. So thank you once again on behalf of the PGIE, on behalf of Hours 23. And I'd like to also thank you once again, Dr. Ketaki, for facilitating this. And we hope that we will maybe have some association with you in the future in some way or form.
You're welcome. Thank you very much again for the invitation. And it was lovely being with you this afternoon, your morning. And have a very successful conference.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and rest well.
Okay. Thank you then. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.